Hi friends. Tonight, we shall step gently into a world long past, where the days began with the crow of a rooster and ended with the slow extinguishing of a tallow candle. Our story is titled, Why You Wouldn't Last a Day as a Victorian Farmer. In it, we shall journey through the life of a humble man of the soil in 19th century England. A world of calloused hands, relentless labour, and quiet resilience. This first chapter begins not with thunder or drama, but with the soft hush of mist curling over a still waking land. The pale fingers of dawn brushed over the English countryside, pulling back the veil of night with a slow and reverent hand. Along the edges of a hedgerow-framed lane, tufts of wild grass shimmered with dew, and the silhouettes of distant oak trees stood solemn beneath a gauze of morning fog. Amidst this hushed splendour, nestled in the rolling hills of Shropshire, sat a modest farmhouse of timber and stone, its thatched roof still darkened by the night's lingering chill. Inside, the air smelled faintly of hearth smoke and drying herbs. On the upper floor, under a coarse woolen blanket, lay Thomas Whitaker, a man of 43 winters, whose life had been shaped by the land he tilled and the seasons he obeyed. He awoke not by clock, but by instinct honed through years of dawn rising. The distant crow of a rooster merely confirmed what his body already knew. It was time. With a sigh that belonged more to weariness than reluctance, Thomas swung his legs from the straw mattress and placed his feet upon the cold wooden floor. The boards creaked softly beneath his weight as he stood, pulling a threadbare shirt over his head and buttoning up his trousers with practiced fingers. His boots, worn and cracked, waited patiently by the door like old companions. Downstairs, the dim light of a single lantern flickered in the kitchen, illuminating the flour-dusted hands of his wife, Margaret. She had been awake an hour before him, as she often was, kneading the day's bread beside the iron stove. Her cheeks were flushed with warmth, her hair tied in a loose bun. Without speaking, she handed him a wooden bowl containing a piece of cheese, a thick crust of barley bread, and a slosh of watered ale. This was not a breakfast of indulgence, but one of function. Thomas ate quickly. There was no time for idleness. Outside, the land waited, always waiting, always needing. He pulled, his coat tight against the damp air, and stepped outside, where the fog hung heavy across the ground. It was the kind of mist that seemed to muffle sound and soften the world, as though all creation were taking one final breath before the day began in earnest. His first stop was the barn, where the cows had begun to low in anticipation. Their warm breath mingled with the chill of the air, creating little clouds that danced with each exhale. He milked them one by one, his hands moving with muscle memory and care. The cows were not simply beasts, they were vital threads in the tapestry of survival. Afterward, he fed the pigs, who grunted and jostled greedily for their slop. The chickens were let loose from their coop to scratch about the yard, their wings flapping with feathery enthusiasm. All of these creatures, noisy and ungrateful as they could be, were assets more valuable than coin in the rural economy of the Victorian era. By mid-morning, it was time to till the fields. The rain of the previous evening had softened the soil, a blessing and a curse. Too much moisture, and the plough would drag heavy and slow, but too little, and the earth would resist. Harnessing his only workhorse, a sturdy beast named Moss, Thomas adjusted the iron plough and began the slow walk up and down the field, carving neat lines into the earth. The ploughing was grueling. Each step required strength. Each pass demanded endurance. His shoulders ached, and his hands, already calloused, stung from the rains. Yet he pressed on, sweat mingling with the fog that still clung to the air. This field, if well kept, would yield barley, a crop both useful for trade and for sustaining his own family through the long winter. Around noon, Thomas returned briefly to the house. The children, Sarah aged 9 and James only 7, had just returned from the parish school, their cheeks pink from the walk. They spoke of reading primers and arithmetic, while Margaret ladled out a thin vegetable stew into clay bowls. They All ate in silence, save for the children's chatter. Even during meals, the day's work clung to Thomas like dust on his boots. The afternoon brought no rest. A section of fencing had collapsed during the previous night's wind, and Thomas set about repairing it, hammering in new posts and stringing wire with blistered fingers. He paused only to examine a patch of his potatoes for signs of blight, a silent enemy that could ruin months of labor in a single week. Fortunately, all seemed well for now. As the sun began to set, casting amber light across the horizon, the fog lifted at last, unveiling the rich green of his fields and the soft gold of hay in the barn. The land, demanding though it was, remained, beautiful in its way, ancient, temperamental, and deeply alive. Returning the tools to their shed, Thomas completed his rounds. He checked the stable, secured the animals, and gave Moss a pat of thanks. Then, with weariness etched into his bones, he walked back to the house where Margaret had lit a candle and set out their final meal. A bit of cold meat, more bread, and boiled carrots. That night, after the children had been tucked beneath thick quilts and the hearth had grown quiet, Thomas sat beside Margaret in silence. He looked down at his hands, scarred, strong and sore, and knew that tomorrow would be just like today, the same rhythms, the same hardships, but also the same meaning. And as he climbed the stairs and eased into bed, the farmhouse creaked around him like a ship settling into still waters. Outside, the stars blinked above a resting countryside. The land was never easy, but it was his. The first light of the second day on Thomas Whitaker's farm arrived not with grandeur, but with the same quiet insistence that had marked the rhythm of his life for decades. The sun had not yet breached the far hedgerows when the rooster crowed, once more, as if reminding the sleeping world that toil waits for no man, no matter how weary. Thomas's eyes opened before the sound even finished echoing across the yard. He did not stretch. There was no time. Rising from the warmth of the bed, he moved with the familiarity of ritual. He washed his face with cold water from a ceramic basin and pulled on the same wool trousers, the same threadbare shirt. A man could not afford vanity in a life such as his. Only function mattered. Downstairs, Margaret had already lit the hearth, her figure silhouetted in flickering orange. She was humming a psalm under her breath, kneading the dough that would become the family's bread by afternoon. Though her hands were red from flour and the cold, they moved with a grace only repetition brings. Thomas offered her a soft grunt in greeting, and she handed him a mug of steaming barley tea. Thin, but warming. No sugar, of course. That was a luxury they could not afford. He drank in silence, then took a small square of oatcake for the path. And with that, he stepped into the grey morning. The air was colder than yesterday. A crisp bite rode the wind as it swept across the fields. Mist had not yet lifted, and the entire world seemed softened, blurred at the edges. There was peace in the silence, but no idleness in it. The land was a living thing, always hungering for the farmer's attention. Thomas began with the hens. He refilled the feed trays and scattered fresh hay in the nesting boxes, checking carefully for broken shells or signs of fox intrusion. Several hens clucked indignantly at his presence, but yielded their eggs all the same. Into the wicker basket went 9 fragile brown treasures, small but precious. Next, he visited the pigs. The smell hit him first, a pungent mix of damp straw, spoiled vegetable mash, and the earthy odour of swine. But to Thomas, it was familiar, almost comforting. The pigs grunted and surged forward as he emptied 2 buckets of scraps into their trough, then set about cleaning their pens. It was back-breaking work, bending and shoveling, lifting and spreading. By the time he finished, the sky had begun to lighten. Then came the cattle. The barn doors creaked open, revealing a line of patient eyes blinking at him from the shadows. Thomas whispered a soft greeting to each of the cows as he passed them, calling them by name, Bessie, Dot, and young Clover. These beasts were not pets, but companions of a kind. He milked them by hand, the rhythm of the task meditative, the sound of milk hitting the pail like a soft, wet heartbeat. An hour later, the fieldwork began. Today's task was the wheat. The crop, now just breaking the surface of the soil, demanded vigilance. Early in the growing season, the wheat was vulnerable to crows, to insects, to mold, and worst of all, to weeds. Thomas strapped on his canvas apron, filled a small sack with seed, and headed toward the eastern field. With a practiced swing of his arm, he cast seed in careful arcs across the tilled furrows, minding the rhythm and spacing. The air was still, damp, and the earth soft beneath his boots. He spoke aloud to himself as he worked, not from madness, but from solitude. The land did not respond, but it listened. Halfway through the task, he paused. A shape moved at the edge of the field. It was Sarah, his daughter, barefoot and red-cheeked, her wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She had come to bring him a rag soaked in cool water and a biscuit. "You forgot your satchel," she said simply. Thomas gave a grateful nod and took the small cloth from her hands, wiping the sweat from his brow. "What did I do to deserve such a helper?" Sarah smiled, but said nothing more. She watched the wind move through the grass for a moment, then turned and padded away across the furrows. The biscuit crumbled in his hand, but it was sweet with honey, a rare indulgence. Margaret must have saved some from the last market trip. He chewed slowly, eyes fixed on the distant tree line, where a kestrel circled lazily above. By noon, the wheat rows were fed and cleaned, and Thomas returned to the farmhouse for the midday meal. This was the warmest part of the day, though the sun remained hazy behind high clouds. Inside, the children were sitting with slates in their laps, copying letters as Margaret stirred a pot of parsnip and onion soup. The food was simple but hearty, served with small slices of cheese and thick, brown bread. James recited his sums between spoonfuls, eager for approval. Margaret, always practical, corrected him gently but firmly. Even in the poorest households, knowledge was a candle in the dark. After eating, Thomas allowed himself the smallest of luxuries. 5 minutes on the bench beside the hearth, the warmth of the fire, the scent of soup, and the soft clatter of Margaret washing dishes made the house feel, for a moment, like a world apart from the demands outside. But it never lasted long. As the sun began its slow descent, Thomas was back, in the fields, this time repairing the wall that bordered the property. Stones had fallen in last month's rain, and if left uncorrected, could invite stray sheep or worse, foxes. He worked slowly, lifting and replacing the stones, applying a thick mortar of clay and straw. By the time the work was done, his fingers were numb and raw. Evening came quietly. Margaret lit the oil lamp, and the children were allowed to read a passage from their Bible before supper. They huddled together near the hearth, their faces bathed in golden light as Sarah's small voice recited the Psalms. Supper was humble, leftover soup and barley mash, but shared with gratitude. Afterward, the family took a brief walk around the yard. The stars were beginning to appear, one by one, pricking the velvet sky. It was James who noticed the owl perched on the barn beam, its head swiveling with uncanny stillness. And then it was bedtime. Margaret tucked the children in while Thomas locked the barn and extinguished the last of the lanterns. Inside the farmhouse, only one candle remained, its flame flickering like a secret between husband and wife. "I saw a crow near the wheat," Thomas said softly. Margaret looked up from her sewing. "We'll hang the scarecrow tomorrow." He nodded. The fire had gone out, but the embers glowed, and as Thomas lay in bed once more, muscles aching and soul satisfied, he closed his eyes to the sound of a nightjar calling far across the field, an ancient song in a land as old as time. The third morning broke colder than the last, with a sharpness in the air that hinted at an approaching frost. The mist was thinner today, but a biting wind moved through the branches like a warning whispered from the woods. Thomas Whitaker stood by the tool shed, the wooden door groaning as he opened it wide. Within the shadowed space, The implements of his life hung on rough pegs, silent, rust-tinged, worn by time and the endless cycle of seasons. This was no ordinary place. To an outsider, the shed might seem merely functional, but to Thomas, it was a sanctuary of purpose. Every spade, scythe, hammer and hoe carried a story, etched into the grooves of wood handles and the dulled edges of steel. These tools were extensions of his hands, partners in a lifelong contract with the land. Today's work required them all. The main project was mending the southern paddock gate. A storm a fortnight ago had knocked it askew, leaving the hinges groaning and the post leaning like a drunkard in a ditch. Such weakness in the farm's defences was unacceptable. A stray cow or a clever fox could do more harm in a day than a week's labour could undo. With a heavy sigh and a toolbox slung over his shoulder, Thomas began the trudge down the field path. The soil beneath his boots had dried and cracked in places, and the wind carried the smell of old leaves and peat. He passed under a crooked hawthorn tree, its red berries bright as blood against the grey sky, and heard the low bleating of a lamb from the neighbouring field. At the paddock, he knelt beside the gate, examining the warped wood and rusting hardware. A hinge had pulled loose from the post entirely, and the latch was bent beyond repair. He set the toolbox down and began his work. The hammer fell with the satisfying thud of metal against oak. Nails, forged locally and traded at the village smithy, were driven deep into the beam. The gate resisted at first. It always did. But Thomas coaxed it back into alignment, wedging supports beneath its frame and bracing it with stone until the wood stopped creaking under its own weight. Each strike, each adjustment was done with care. There was no rush, no need for speed. This was the rhythm of a Victorian farmer's life, slow, methodical, enduring. Work was not just a necessity, but a language, a way of communicating with the world around him. And Thomas spoke fluently with his hands. By mid-morning, the gate stood firm once again. He stepped back and admired the symmetry, wiping his brow with a handkerchief stained from years of service. He took a moment, then turned back toward the shed to gather tools for his next task, sharpening the scythe. The scythe, with its long curved blade and ashwood handle, was among the most respected tools on the farm. It had belonged to his father before him, and to his grandfather before that. Sharpening it was not a chore but a rite, a reminder that even steel must be honed if it is to remain useful. Back in the shed, Thomas lit a small lantern and set the blade upon a block of worn leather. He used a whetstone soaked in oil, drawing it slowly along the edge in careful sweeps. Each motion rang faintly, like a whisper in the silence. As he worked, his mind wandered, not in laziness, but in reflection. He thought of his father's hands, now gone more than a decade, and how they had once held this same blade, moving with the same care. He remembered the first time he had been allowed to use it alone, his nervous fingers trembling around the grip, his father watching quietly from the fence. The past never left him. It was in the grain of the wood, the scent of oil and iron, the ache in his shoulder. It was memory, inheritance, and duty, woven together into something as unyielding as the land itself. Once satisfied with the edge, Thomas left the shed and walked to the eastern meadow, where a patch of wild grasses had grown tall and thick. These would be cut for bedding straw and mulch, but more than that, they provided a quiet moment of grace, a chance to feel the rhythm of the scythe. He stepped into the field and took up the tool. The first sweep was deliberate. The blade cut through the stalks with a soft swish, laying them down like fallen soldiers. Thomas moved slowly, in arcs, each motion a part of a dance passed down through generations. There was peace in it, this work. The wind moved through the grass and the birds called overhead, but beneath it all was the sound of the scythe, a gentle, consistent slicing that soothed the soul. An hour passed, then 2. By the time the midday bell chimed from the village church, barely audible in the distance, Thomas had cleared a large swath of the meadow. He gathered the grass into neat bundles and bound them with twine, stacking them under a willow tree to dry. His arms burned, but there was a strange satisfaction in the pain, a kind of clarity. Back at the house, Margaret had prepared a thick porridge of oats and turnips. The children were studying Latin verses today, hunched over worn books at the table. Thomas ate with them, listening as Sarah recited a passage from Virgil with halting confidence. "How does it help knowing old Roman words?" James asked, wrinkling his nose. "It sharpens your mind," Thomas said between spoonfuls. "And a sharp mind is as useful as a sharp blade." Margaret smiled at that. She often said Thomas had a poet's soul, even if he rarely used it. After the meal, there was little time for rest. The sky was shifting, clouds gathering low and thick on the horizon. Rain was coming, perhaps a storm. He needed to secure the thatch, check the drainage ditch, and cover the fresh hay in the barn. The afternoon passed in a flurry of preparation. With each task completed, Thomas felt the rising tension in the air, the way the wind began to hum, the way the birds fell silent. He worked faster, driven by a sense older than words. The farm had to be made ready. And just as he pulled the last tarp over the hay bales, the first drops began to fall. He stood for a moment in the doorway of the barn, watching the rain roll in sheets across the field. It struck the earth with the sound of distant applause, and the soil drank it in greedily. Evening found the family huddled close, fire crackling, windows rattling from the wind. The storm outside roared, but inside the farmhouse all was secure. Thomas sat quietly by the hearth, oil lamp flickering beside him, and began to oil his tools, each one lovingly, each one with care, because tomorrow the work would begin again. The storm had passed in the early hours, slipping away before dawn as silently as it had arrived. Its trail, however, remained etched across the land. The once firm earth now wore a shroud of mud, and the hedgerows sagged beneath the weight of rainwater. Puddles dotted the cobbled yard like small mirrors, reflecting the grey sky and the weary shape of Thomas Whitaker as he stood in the doorway, boots already thick with soil. Inside the house, the children still slept, bundled under patchwork quilts, and Margaret was peeling potatoes near the hearth, her hands moving with habitual grace. Thomas, however, had no time for warmth. Rain, though often a blessing, demanded repair, review, and labour in its aftermath. He stepped outside into the softened world, the air cool and heavy with the scent of damp wood and wet straw. His first stop was the barn, where the livestock had ridden out the storm. Bessie, Dot, and Clover lowed softly as he entered, their breaths fogging the cool air. He checked each one, running a hand along their flanks, inspecting hooves and bedding. All seemed well, though the back window had leaked slightly. He made a mental note to seal it with fresh putty and a patch of canvas. The chickens, by contrast, were in poor humour. Their coop was soaked, and several had huddled together in a corner where the straw was still dry. He clucked back at them, in consolation, as he cleared out the wet bedding and replaced it with hay drawn from the upper loft, hay not yet ruined by the storm. It was a familiar kind of ruin, not catastrophic, but annoying in its pettiness. A bit of wood here, a drip there, a fence post loosened, a seed row disturbed. Each small injury left by the storm required attention. Thomas walked the perimeter of the farm, eyes scanning for damage, noting each swollen ditch, each fallen branch. Near the edge of the barley field, he found a scarecrow toppled, its straw guts spilling across the furrowed earth. He set it back upright, driving its post deep into the saturated ground and tying its ragged arms anew. The field itself had suffered some washout. The barley rows were uneven now, and pools had formed in the lowest parts. He knelt and examined the seedlings, fragile things trying to root in shifting soil. Many had survived, but they looked battered, their green shoots bent like old men in the wind. He whispered encouragement to no one, then stood and moved on. By mid-morning, Thomas was deep in the drainage ditch, shovel in hand. The storm had clogged it with leaves and mud, and if it remained blocked, the lower pastures would flood. The work was slow and dirty. He sank knee-deep in the mire, digging, lifting, tossing muck aside. His back protested, but he did not stop. To pause was to fall behind, and in farming, falling behind could mean hunger. As he worked, his thoughts drifted, inevitably, as they often did, to what life might be like if the rains did not ease. He remembered stories from his grandfather, who spoke of a summer when nothing grew and families boiled roots and tree bark to make a kind of soup. That kind of hardship had not touched Thomas's children yet, but it hovered always at the edge of memory, a spectre never fully banished. Eventually, the ditch began to clear. Water moved again, slow and brown, finding its way along the path. He carved for it. He stood and wiped his hands on his trousers, breathing hard, eyes scanning the clouds for more trouble. It was just after noon when he returned to the farmhouse, boots slapping wetly against the flagstones. Margaret met him at the door with a cloth to wipe his brow and a bowl of lentil stew, hot and steaming. Sarah and James had finished their morning studies and were playing with wooden dolls and carved animals by the fire. As he ate, Thomas listened to the children's chatter. They spoke of fairies in the woods and knights with feathered hats, their imaginations still untouched by the weight of labour. He envied them that, not with bitterness, but with a kind of wistful gratitude, thankful they had not yet had to trade, their dreams for ploughshares. After the meal, he left the house again to begin clearing the west path, the one that led to the village. Fallen branches and runoff had made it impassable, and it was likely the vicar or the blacksmith would be checking in later that week. With a handsaw and cart, Thomas set about trimming, hauling and tidying the old lane. This work, though less grueling than others, required patience. He cleared the brambles first, then the windfall, twisted limbs that still dripped with rain. As he worked, a group of sparrows flitted above him, landing briefly on branches before darting away again. Their presence was a comfort. Nature, however, damaged, always found its rhythm. By the time the sun dipped toward the hills, the path was clear again. Not perfect, never perfect, but good enough. And that was the truth of the Victorian farmer's life. Good enough was victory. Perfect was a dream, best left to poets and parliament men. As twilight settled in, Thomas sat on the edge of the lane for a moment and listened. The rain-soaked world had begun to sing again, quietly, modestly. Frogs chirped in the ditches. A fox barked in the distance. The breeze moved through the branches with a softened sigh. He stood, joints stiff, and made the slow walk home. Supper was salt pork and carrots, with a bit of cider left over from autumn. The fire burned warmly, and Margaret's voice filled the room as she read aloud from a borrowed book, a tale of distant lands and noble deeds. The children leaned close, eyes wide. Thomas watched them, half listening, half asleep already. The warmth, the full belly, the soft cadence of his wife's voice. It all wove around him like a quilt. When at last he climbed into bed, he took a moment to listen again. No thunder, no wind, just the quiet breath of a world washed clean. The storm had passed, and tomorrow, the work would begin again. The bells of St. Agnes rang out faintly in the morning air, echoing across the fields like a summons. It was market day in the village, an event that marked time as surely as the seasons. For Thomas Whitaker, this day was more than a chance to trade. It was a necessary reckoning, where the fruits of his labour would be measured not in rows of wheat or buckets of milk, but in copper coins and the barbed gaze of townsfolk. He rose early, even before the rooster crowed. The sky outside was painted in soft lilac, streaked with gold. Dew blanketed the grass like frost, and the chill in the air hinted that summer was nearing its end. He moved about the kitchen in silence, wrapping a slice of oatcake in cloth and filling a jug with a small portion of milk. On the table lay a small bundle, eggs, a round of cheese, and 2 lengths of homespun wool. This was all he could afford to bring, each item carefully chosen to trade or sell. Margaret met him at the doorway, tucking a small envelope of dried herbs into his satchel. "If Mrs. Avery's there, see if she'll give us soap for these," she said softly. He nodded. Margaret had a sharp mind for barter, sharper than his, he admitted. She knew which merchants drove hard bargains and which could be coaxed into fairness with a compliment or a kind word. He relied on her instincts, more than he let on. Harnessing the cart horse, Moss, took longer than usual. The harness straps had stiffened from dampness, and the old beast was reluctant to rise. But with a few gentle words and a firm tug, Thomas got him moving. Soon they were on the road, cartwheels rattling over stone and mud. The path to the village wound through woods and fields, passing by neighbouring farms and the quiet bend of the river. As they moved, Thomas passed familiar sights. A cottage with ivy climbing its walls, a flock of geese waddling along a hedge, and a young shepherd boy dozing under a tree. Life outside the farm felt strange, like stepping into a story he did, not right. By the time they reached the village square, the market was in full bloom. Stalls lined the cobbled streets, their canvas awnings snapping in the breeze. Voices rose in cheerful argument, and the smells of baking bread, roasting meat, and freshly tilled soil mingled in the air. Thomas pulled the cart into his usual spot, near the corner where the cooper sold barrels and a fiddler sometimes played, for spare coin. He laid out his wares carefully. Eggs nestled in straw, the cheese wrapped in waxed cloth, the wool folded neatly. Then he waited. Market day required patience and subtlety. The goal was not simply to sell, but to do so wisely, trading where coin was scarce, negotiating where coin was plenty. It began slowly. A baker offered him a loaf and a slab of lard in exchange for 3 eggs. Fair enough. A cobbler admired the wool, but could not pay this week. A widow asked the price of the cheese and frowned at his answer, walking away with a purse still heavy. Then came Mrs. Avery, bustling and plump, her apron pockets brimming with trinkets. She examined the herbs Margaret had prepared and pursed. Her lips. "You've added peppermint this time," she said. "Aye, and wild chamomile," Thomas replied. She considered. "That'll do. You'll get your soap, and I'll take 2 ounces of the wool besides. Can't have my Arthur catching." "Chill again," Thomas agreed, and the exchange was made. Soap, herbs, wool. All passed between hands with the quiet dignity of necessity. No paper, no signatures, just trust and reputation. The rest of the day passed in measured steps. He managed to trade the last of the eggs for a pouch of salt and a dozen nails. The cheese was sold outright, and with that coin, he bought lamp oil and a small tin whistle for James, tucked secretly into his coat. Before he left, he stopped by the vicar's stall, where used books were laid out beside jars of jam. Margaret had asked for a new volume of scripture readings, but he found none in good repair. Instead, he picked a slender book of verse, its pages worn but still legible. "For winter evenings," he told himself. As the sun began its slow descent, Thomas loaded the cart with the purchases and turned Moss toward home. The road back felt longer, as it always did when his back ached and his pockets were lighter than he'd hoped. But there was satisfaction too, a sense of having done what was needed, of having brought something useful home. He arrived just after sunset. The sky was a canvas of rose and indigo, and the farmhouse windows glowed with candlelight. Sarah met him at the gate, face lit with curiosity. "Did they like the cheese?" she asked. "They did," he replied, handing her the tin whistle. "Your brother will need your help learning a tune." Her eyes lit up, and she ran inside with a joyful squeal. Later, over supper, Margaret examined the goods he had returned, with, nodding at his choices. "You did well," she said simply, and he felt a rare warmth bloom in his chest. Her approval was not given lightly. The children played a game on the floor with river stones, while Thomas leaned back, sipping a small mug of cider. He watched them quietly, fingers idly tracing the edge of the book of verse he had found. When at last the fire burned low, and the house grew quiet. He opened it and read a few lines aloud to Margaret. Through furrowed field and bramble grey, the farmer walks his weary way. But stars shall rise, and crops shall grow, and in the dusk his heart shall know. He did not finish the verse. Instead, he closed the book, placed it on the table, and listened to the ticking of the clock. Market day had come and gone. The coin had changed hands. The goods had found new homes. And tomorrow, the soil would once again call his name. The sun rose slowly, reluctant, it seemed, to lift itself above the horizon. Its first golden light filtered through the farmhouse windows and cast long shadows across the worn floorboards. Another day had come, and with it, the beginning of the harvest season, a time of urgency and aching limbs, where each hour of light held the weight of survival. Thomas Whitaker stirred before the sun's ascent was complete. His body protested, his hands still raw from gripping the market cart, his legs sore from the long walk home, but there was no time to indulge pain. The harvest did not care for blisters, nor did it wait for rest. Downstairs, Margaret was already stoking the fire. The smell of porridge thickened with a touch of honey filled the air, and she glanced up at him with knowing eyes. "You'll need gloves today," she said simply, setting a bowl on the table. "The barley's tall, and the straw's sharp." Thomas nodded. In the shed, he fetched a pair of leather gloves, patched many times over, and his reaping hook. The blade, curved and gleaming, was one of the few tools kept near sharp as a matter of reverence. Reaping was a sacred act, a ritual repeated since men first bent before wheat and begged it for life. He stepped out into the warming air, the fields, glowing with the low morning sun. The barley stood golden and high, swaying gently in the breeze like an ocean of grain. This was their wealth, their hope, and their burden. Harvesting would take days, perhaps weeks, and all hands would be needed. Even the children, in their small ways, would play a part. Thomas began slowly, methodically. His hook sliced through the stalks with a practiced rhythm: grip, pull, cut, lay down. Each bundle was tied and stacked, the work forming a soothing, hypnotic cadence. The first hour passed in silence, save for the swish of straw and the rustling of wind. Then came the ache. Harvesting bent a man forward. It pulled at his shoulders and knees. It filled his gloves with sweat and turned his forearms red with the touch of straw. Yet there was beauty in the struggle, in the scent of sun-warmed grain, in the flutter of larks disturbed by motion, in the knowledge that this toil meant bread, meant warmth, meant life. Around midday, Margaret arrived with water and slices of apple wrapped in cloth. Sarah and James trailed behind, carrying baskets and singing a song about blackbirds and hedgerows. "May we help, Papa?" James asked, eyes wide with purpose. "You may gather what's fallen," Thomas said gently. "Not all that's useful grows on the stalk." And so they joined him. Sarah collected loose barley heads into her apron, careful not to crush them. James followed, picking up stray stalks and humming to himself. Margaret, her face shaded by a bonnet, stood by with a jug of water, her presence both comfort and command. The sun climbed higher. By afternoon, their stacks grew tall, and Thomas's arms trembled with each new cut. Still, he pressed on. The weather was fair. Tomorrow might not be. One good day in the fields could not be squandered, so they harvested until the shadows grew long and the sky deepened from blue to violet. Back at the house, the children were sent to wash while Thomas stored the day's gleanings in the barn. Each bundle was carefully laid in rows, out of reach of damp and vermin. He paused once to admire the bounty. It was not enough to last the winter, not yet, but it was a start, and every harvest began with a first sheaf. Supper that night was hearty: roasted potatoes, collard greens, and a rare treat, pigeon stew, the birds taken that morning from a trap set near the wheat. As they ate, Sarah recounted her gathering, triumphs with glee, and James showed a small stone he had found, shaped like a heart. "It's lucky," he insisted. "It'll keep the rain away." Margaret smiled at that. "Then let's keep it by the window, where the clouds can see it." After the meal, Thomas sat by the hearth with his feet resting on a stool. He removed his gloves and examined his hands. The blisters were rising now, one across the pad of his thumb, another near his palm. They would break by morning, and the skin beneath would sting, but he would work through it. There was no other choice. Margaret knelt beside him and, without a word, dipped a cloth into warm water and began cleaning the wounds. Her touch was firm but kind, and Thomas closed his eyes as the pain gave way to calm. Outside, the stars were blinking into existence, scattered across the sky like lanterns, hung by unseen hands. A light breeze moved through the trees, carrying the scent of barley and the promise of more work to come. As Margaret finished bandaging his hand, Thomas reached for her wrist gently. "Thank you," he said. She met his gaze. "You bring it home. I keep it whole." In that simple exchange was a love stronger than poetry. Later, as the family climbed into bed, Thomas lingered at the window. The moon hung low, casting silver light over the fields. From this vantage, the farm seemed a patchwork quilt. Barn, coop, hedgerows, and now neat stacks of barley catching the light like fire. He whispered a small prayer, not for ease, but for strength, for fair weather, for good yield, for endurance, and then, with aching limbs and a mind heavy with tomorrow's plans, he allowed himself to sleep. The morning sky was tinged with iron grey. Clouds stretched thin across the heavens like wool carded too long. The air held a stillness, the kind that preceded either a gentle drizzle or a downpour, and Thomas Whitaker felt the need to prepare. Today, he would visit the village blacksmith, not for trade, but for necessity. The blade of his reaping hook had dulled, and though he'd tried to keep it honed with oil and whetstone, the edge no longer sang through the barley with ease. Worse still, the handles of two of his spades had begun to split, the wood swollen from last month's rains and weakened from years of hard use. These tools could not fail him now, not during harvest. After a small breakfast of boiled eggs and barley bread, he wrapped the tools in canvas and loaded them onto a handcart. The walk to the blacksmith's forge was shorter than the trek to market, but heavier. Each mile underfoot brought with it not just the burden of tools, but the humbling reality of reliance. No farmer stood alone, no matter how self-reliant he might appear. The village forge stood near the edge of town, a squat stone building with a chimney that always smoked and a door that always creaked. Inside, the air was a dance of heat and hammer, the glow of coals casting every surface in shades of orange and red. The blacksmith, a broad-shouldered man named Edmund Hartley, stood beside the anvil, sweat already dampening his brow. He looked up as Thomas entered, his face breaking into a grin. "Thought I might see you soon. Harvest's begun, has it?" Thomas nodded, setting down the bundle. "Blades dull. 2 spades need binding." Edmund gestured him closer. "Let's have a look." With the care of a priest examining relics, Edmund unwrapped the canvas. He ran his thick fingers along the edge of the hook, then inspected the splintered handles of the spades. "You've kept 'em in good shape, but they've had a life, these tools." Thomas offered a faint smile. "As have I." Edmund chuckled and set to work. The forge roared to life, bellows breathing fire into the heart of the coals. Sparks leapt with every strike of hammer against steel, and the sound echoed through the building like a heartbeat made of thunder. Thomas watched in silence, mesmerized. There was something elemental in the blacksmith's labor, a raw, beautiful violence that shaped the world. As the blade was tempered anew, the metal hissed in oil, sending up curls of smoke scented with fire and age. Edmund hammered a new rivet into one of the spades, his arms moving with practiced precision. Between strikes they spoke, not often, but meaningfully. "Barley holding up?" Edmund asked. "I took some wash in the rain, but the heads are firm. Storm rolled through here too," the blacksmith said, wiping his brow. "Tore the weather vane right off the church roof." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Then perhaps the Lord's trying to tell us something." Edmund snorted. "Aye, that we ought to hammer tighter nails." When the work was done, the tools gleamed with renewed life. The blade of the hook was sharper than it had been in years, its edge catching the light like a whisper. The spades had fresh bindings, their handles firm once more. Thomas reached for his purse, but Edmund shook his head. "Bring me a dozen eggs next week," he said simply, "and a wedge of Margaret's cheese, if she'll spare it." "Done," Thomas replied, the quiet gratitude in his voice needing no embellishment. He loaded the tools back onto the cart and stepped outside. The sky had begun to darken further, and the first drops of rain fell upon his hat with soft insistence. He pulled his coat tighter and began the walk home. The road was quiet, the village seeming to hold its breath. Only the distant clatter of a shutter in the wind and the occasional bark of a dog accompanied his return. Yet Thomas did not mind the silence. It gave him time to think, to reflect on how many hands it took to make one farm stand. The weaver, who sold them sacks, the cooper who made barrels, the miller, the smith, their lives were threads in the same tapestry, each pulling its weight. Back at the farmhouse, the rain was coming steadier now. Margaret stood at the door, arms crossed, her eyes scanning the horizon behind him. "You made good time," she said as he reached the stoop. "Could smell the rain coming," he replied, setting the tools inside. He showed her the blade, freshly honed. She traced her fingers along the metal and nodded approvingly. "That'll cut well," she said. "Tomorrow we finish the west field." The children helped him dry the tools and hang them in the shed. Sarah was especially fascinated by the new binding on the spade, asking questions about the blacksmith, the fire, the forge. Thomas answered, patiently, knowing that every curious word was a seed planted. Supper that night was simple. Turnip soup with a bit of smoked meat and apples poached in honey. As they ate, James showed them a drawing he'd made, a rough depiction of their farm, complete with fields, barns, and scarecrows. "You forgot the dog," Sarah pointed out, and James hastily added a small, lopsided animal in the corner. Laughter filled the kitchen. It was not loud, nor long-lasting, but it warmed the space like a second fire. Later, after the dishes were done and the rain fell steady on the roof, Thomas sat alone by the hearth. He held the reaping hook in his lap, running his thumb along the new edge. It would be a long harvest, a hard one perhaps, but with tools repaired and a spirit renewed, he felt ready. He stood, set the hook beside the door, and climbed the stairs to bed. Outside, the rain continued its gentle drumbeat on the shingles. The world, it seemed, was reminding him that even in storms, work goes on. The harvest moon was rising, swollen, golden, and heavy with ancient promise. It hung low over the fields like a great watchful eye. Its glow spilled over the hedgerows, illuminated the barley stacks, and cast long shadows across the stone walls of the Whitaker farm. It was a moon that had watched generations reap and sow, labour and rest. And on this night, it watched Thomas Whitaker as he stood in his doorway, cap in hand, gaze lifted skyward. The west field was nearly done. Tomorrow the family would begin on the oats, smaller yields, but just as necessary. The harvest season had its own hunger, its own relentless rhythm. And though his limbs ached and the blisters on his hands had broken days ago, Thomas found within himself a quiet strength. It came not from ease, but from knowing that he was part of a cycle much older than himself. That morning had begun like all the others, with the rooster's crow and Margaret's steady steps on the floor below. But there had been a stillness in the air, a subtle shift that only farmers and fishermen tend to feel. The sky, though clear, held a faint shimmer that spoke of coming frost, and the breeze carried with it the scent of pine and distant smoke. After breakfast, Thomas had walked the perimeter of the oat field, eyes scanning the stalks. They bent, gently in the wind, golden and ripe, whispering secrets to one another in a tongue only the wind could understand. He reached out and touched a stalk, rolling the grain between his fingers. The time had come. He returned to the house and gathered his family. "Today, we start the oats," he said simply. Margaret nodded. Sarah and James exchanged glances, part pride, part weariness. Harvesting was no longer new to them, but it remained a marvel, even in its hardship. They laced their boots, donned their hats, and followed Thomas to the field. Work began in the eastern rows. The sun had not yet reached its zenith when the first bundles were tied and stacked. Thomas worked with slow efficiency, guiding the children, correcting their knots, teaching them how to cut without damaging the head of grain. Margaret moved among them with baskets and binding twine, her sleeves rolled, her brow damp. By noon, they paused. Margaret passed around slices of cold pie and cups of watered cider. They ate seated among the oats, the warm grain brushing against their shoulders like friendly ghosts. It was then that Thomas noticed the sky again. The light had changed, subtly, beautifully. The clouds had drifted apart, revealing a high, pale moon that stood visible even in the daytime sky. It hovered there, ghost-like, a quiet omen. "Harvest moon's early," he murmured. Margaret looked up and shaded her eyes. "Early moon. Early frost? Perhaps," he said. "Or perhaps just a reminder." Of what? He did not say. But in his heart, Thomas felt the truth. The land was generous, but never guaranteed. Each harvest could be the last good one. A cold season, a failed seed, a sick cow, any of these could tip the scales. And so, every gathering, every sheaf laid down, every bundle tied was more than labor. It was hope stitched into earth. That afternoon, work resumed. James fell once, tangled in the stalks, and laughed despite the bruise. Sarah scolded him, but she smiled as she helped him up. Thomas watched them for a moment, their small hands busy, their faces flushed with sun. He remembered his own childhood, harvesting beside his father, the sun warm on his neck, the scent of oats in the air. Time folded inward, and he saw himself both then and now, scythe in hand, heart full of the same silent prayer. By evening, the lower rows were done. They left the field carrying bundles to the barn, each step a quiet triumph. Inside, Thomas stacked the oats carefully, mindful of damp, spacing the bundles so they could breathe. When the last one was laid down, he rested a moment against the doorframe and listened. The farm was never silent. Even at night it whispered, creaking beams, rustling straw, distant owl calls. But this evening, there was something else. A hush, a waiting. He stepped outside and saw the moon rising in earnest, now bold and bright against the darkening sky. It lit the landscape in silver and gold, casting shadows as sharp as blades. He removed his cap, not from heat, but from reverence. Behind him, Margaret approached. She held a shawl around her shoulders and a small tin lantern in her hand. The candle within flickered with each breath of wind. "You see it too?" she asked. He nodded. They stood side by side, watching the moon rise higher, listening to the world hold its breath. "I remember your father," Margaret said softly. "He used to say a harvest moon could see a man's soul." Thomas smiled faintly. He said many things. They lingered in the yard, lantern light mingling with moonlight. Then quietly, Margaret reached for his hand. "I said a prayer today," she whispered. "For what? For next season, for the seeds we'll save, for the ground to be soft, for the rain to be kind." Thomas looked at her then, his weathered face illuminated in gold and shadow. "Then it's a good prayer." That night, the family ate late, the moonlight spilling across the table from the window. After supper, Thomas read from the book of verse he'd bought on market day. His voice, low and deliberate, wove each line like a thread into the hush of the house. When at last they went to bed, the moon still poured its light across the fields, and the harvest slept beneath its gaze. Tomorrow would come, and with it, the scythe, the baskets, the labour. But for now, under the watchful eye of the moon, they rested. It was the kind of morning that whispered secrets. The mist clung low to the earth, curling around fence posts and creeping over the freshly reaped fields, as though reluctant to let go of the night. The sun struggled to pierce it, casting a pale, diffused light that made the world feel hushed, even holy. Thomas Whitaker had just finished lacing his boots when the knock came at the door, hurried and uneven. He opened it to find young Jacob Ellis, the neighbour boy from half a mile down the lane, cheeks flushed and eyes wide. "Sir," he said, breathless, "my dar sent me. One of our calves is gone. Gate was broken. Tracks lead toward your woods." Thomas didn't hesitate. He fetched his coat, his staff, and a slice of oatcake to chew on as he walked. "Tell your father I'll look while I make my rounds." The Ellis farm was smaller than the Whitakers, and the loss of a single calf could mean weeks of hardship. Thomas knew the woods well. Dense groves of birch and ash, a stream that curved like a ribbon through the trees, and paths that animals sometimes followed, confused or drawn by scent and instinct. As he walked through the morning mist, he watched for the telltale signs: hoofprints in the mud, broken twigs, disturbed bramble. The trees closed in, their branches bare of birdsong, and a deep hush settled over the forest floor. He found the tracks within minutes, small, deep prints heading into the underbrush. He followed them, careful with his steps, listening for movement. The deeper he went, the more the mist thickened, curling like ghostly fingers between the trees. At last, he heard it, a faint, plaintive bleating. He followed the sound to a small hollow where the calf stood trembling beside the stream. Mud clung to its legs and its eyes rolled with fear, but it was unharmed. It turned at the sound of his voice, calm, low. And though it backed away at first, Thomas crouched, speaking softly, slowly reaching out his hand. Minutes passed. Patience prevailed. He tied a length of rope around its neck and began the slow walk back. The calf resisted at times, but he tugged gently, guiding it with a farmer's certainty. When they emerged from the woods, the sun had finally won its battle with the mist, casting long beams across the fields. He delivered the calf to the Ellis farm, just as Jacob's father emerged from the barn. The relief in the man's face needed no words. "Thought we'd lost her for good," he said. Thomas simply nodded. "Gate needs mending. I'll see to it." The man offered coin, a small handful, but Thomas refused it. "Just keep her warm tonight. She's shaken." He returned home by midday, the sun high and the fields humming with the quiet industry of autumn. Margaret was in the yard, laying onions out to dry on a rack. The children were sorting dried beans into sacks, their fingers stained and nimble. "You've been gone," Margaret said, not accusatory, simply observing. "Calf in the woods," Thomas replied. "Helped it home." She nodded, handing him a jar of water. "The oats are ready for binding." Without further word, he set to work. The rest of the day was occupied with field labour. The oats, now fully harvested, had to be bound into sheaves and carried to the barn. It was heavy work, more so now with his back sore from walking, but he pushed through. Each bundle represented a meal, a trade, a future comfort. The work was tiring, but it gave him something he understood, something clean and certain. That evening, with the sun dipping low and the air crisp with coming frost, Thomas sat in the barn among the sheaves. His hands rested in his lap, calloused and bandaged. The animals shifted quietly in their pens, the scent of straw and grain thick in the air. Margaret joined him, bringing a slice of apple tart wrapped in cloth. "For the calf?" she asked, sitting beside him. He nodded. "No fence lasts forever. Sometimes a gate gives way." She looked at him then, her gaze soft and searching. "You've always known your way through the woods," Thomas smiled faintly. Even the lost need leading, they ate in silence, watching as the last light left the sky. In the distance, a barn owl called once, then again. The stars blinked to life. Later, as they returned to the house, the children were finishing their evening chores. Sarah was sweeping the hearth, and James was arranging kindling for tomorrow's fire. "We'll need to bring the herbs in soon," Margaret said. "Cold's coming," Thomas nodded. "Tomorrow, before sunrise." That night, as he lay in bed, he thought not of oats or grain, nor of tools or trade. He thought of the calf, frightened, lost, yet found. He thought of Jacob running up the high path, of Margaret's tart, of warm hands in a cool barn, and as sleep claimed him, he whispered a quiet prayer, not of need, but of thanks, for the calf had been found. And so, in some small way, had he. The wind had turned sharp. It pulled through the hedgerows like a blade and sent the crows wheeling overhead, their caws loud against the grey sky. Autumn had shifted subtly, as it always did. One morning, it merely whispered of change. The next, it stood bold upon the threshold, rattling the shutters and tugging at coat buttons. It was on such a morning that Margaret told Thomas it was time to visit the herb woman. "She'll have the tincture ready," she said, setting a woven basket beside the door. "We'll need it for James's cough when the frost comes. And you, I know she'll want beeswax and salt in return." Thomas nodded, chewing slowly on a slice of brown bread. The herb woman, Mistress Elspeth, lived in a low stone cottage near the edge of the moor. A half-day's walk, but one worth the journey. Her knowledge of roots, tonics and poultices was whispered of across the parish, and it was said she could name every plant in the county by scent alone. By mid-morning, Thomas had packed the basket with wrapped beeswax from the kitchen hives and a cloth bag of salt traded at the last market. He walked alone, the path winding through fields already turned to stubble and over creeks that sang softly beneath rickety bridges. The sky held a heavy stillness. Low clouds pressed downward, and the light felt filtered, like candle glow trapped behind linen. Thomas's boots left deep impressions in the muddy lane, and the scent of earth and moss rose with every step. He passed no one. Only once did he spot another soul, a shepherd atop a hill, silhouetted beside his dog like a carving in the stone. It was near noon when the herb woman's cottage came into view. Tucked into a hillock and partly overgrown with ivy, it might have been missed entirely, were it not for the thin trail of smoke rising from its crooked chimney. Its garden, though mostly spent for the season, still clung to life with a few stalks of rosemary, bundles of drying lavender, and stalks of hollyhocks bowed beneath their seed pods. He knocked once. The door creaked open after a moment, and there she stood. Elspeth was a woman of indeterminate age, her hair a cloud of grey beneath a wide-brimmed bonnet, her hands stained with the tinctures of her trade. She squinted at Thomas, as though reading a book only she could see. "Come for your winter draught, have you?" she said without preamble. "Aye," Thomas replied, holding out the basket. "Beeswax and salt, as promised." She took the basket without a word and turned back inside, gesturing for him to follow. The cottage smelled of sage, vinegar, and smoke. Dried herbs hung from the rafters like wind chimes of leaves, and bottles lined the shelves, amber, green, blue, each carefully labelled in her sharp, slanted hand. A kettle hissed on the stove, and two wooden chairs faced one another beside a table worn to a soft gloss. Elspeth poured tea, black, unsweetened, strong, and set a small jar on the table. The tincture. Thomas accepted it with both hands and tucked it into his coat pocket. "Your son'll need only 2 drops in warm water come frost," she said. "Any more, and he'll dream of wolves." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Wolves?" She smiled, half amused. "It's strong. Dreams follow, strong things." They sat in quiet for a time, sipping the tea, the wind pushing against the cottage walls, like a tired guest trying to come in. The fire crackled gently, and somewhere overhead, a raven croaked from the chimney top. Elspeth spoke again, voice quieter. "I've heard the grain was good this year," Thomas nodded. "Oats held, barley's drying, potatoes less certain." She looked at him, her gaze piercing. "And the wife? Well, and you?" He hesitated. Tired. She nodded, unsurprised. "You should burn elder at your door on the last harvest night. Keep the shadows long and the rest sweet." "I'll tell Margaret," Thomas replied, though he doubted she'd believe in such things. Before he left, Elspeth gave him 2 more gifts, unasked. One was a small bag of dried thyme and chamomile. "For sleep," she said. "Yours not. The boys." The second was a single strip of willow bark tied with twine. "For pain," she added. "I see it in your hands." He thanked her, leaving coins on the table, though she never asked and might not even touch them. The walk home was slower. The clouds had thickened, and the wind had grown bold, tugging at his coat and sighing through the trees. A few early leaves skittered across the road, dry as old parchment. The sky above held that particular shade of iron that meant frost was just days away. By the time Thomas reached the farmhouse, the lanterns were lit. The children were indoors, their voices a soft murmur through the windows, and the hearth glowed, warmly within. Margaret met him at the door, took the jar of tincture, and examined it closely. She said 2 drops, he murmured. "I'll mark the bottle." He handed her the herbs and the willow bark. "For sleep, and hands." Margaret's mouth twitched, almost a smile. She always knows. They ate stew for supper, thick with root vegetables and a pinch of parsley from the last of the garden. Afterward, Thomas sat by the fire, slowly flexing his hands, feeling the ache there like an old friend. Margaret brought a basin of warm water and the bag of herbs. "Let's see if it helps," she said, placing his hands in the steaming bowl. The scent rose around him, soothing, earthy, kind. As his hands soaked, he closed his eyes and listened to the fire. He thought of Elspeth's words, "Dreams follow strong things." He wondered what dreams he might have left, and whether they were his own, or passed down like land and tools and songs. When it was time for bed, Margaret placed the jar of tincture high on the shelf, out of reach of children. She set the strip of willow bark on the mantel beside a sprig of dried yarrow, and beside that, without a word, she laid a small, withered sprig of elder, not for belief, but for memory. Outside, the wind continued to blow, but inside, they rested. The frost came in the night, soft as a sigh. It crept in silently, painting each leaf, each roof tile, and each blade of grass with a brittle lace of white. The world, so recently full of motion and rustling colour, had been stilled under a crystal veil. The sky at dawn was pale and clear, tinged with pink like the inside of a seashell, and the breath of every living thing hung in the air like smoke. Thomas Whitaker woke before the sun had fully risen. The chill had seeped into his bones during the night, despite the heavy wool blankets, and it was his knees that told him the frost had arrived long before his eyes confirmed it. With a low groan, he sat up, rubbed the stiffness from his legs, and dressed quickly in the half-light. Downstairs, the hearth was dark. Margaret stood beside it, coaxing the embers back to life with dry kindling and a practiced hand. The children remained wrapped in their quilts in the loft, their sleep undisturbed by the change in season. Thomas reached for a split log and added it to the fire. The flames caught with a crack and a hiss, the scent of pine and smoke filling the kitchen. Margaret met his eye and nodded. "It's here." "Aye," he said simply. First frost marked a turning point on the farm. It was not yet winter, but the land had made its intentions known. From this day forward, the work would be different. Less about growth, more about survival. The last of the harvest had to be brought in quickly, and the farm made ready to endure the lean months. Breakfast was sparse, leftover oats warmed with a bit of molasses, and thin slices of last week's bread toasted over the flame. The tea was strong and bitter but hot. They ate without conversation, the silence comfortable and focused. Afterward, Thomas stepped outside. The crunch of frost underfoot echoed through the yard, and his breath clouded before him. The fields glittered under the low sun, every fence post and straw bundle crowned in white. The barn roof was rimmed in ice, and the windows of the tool shed fogged with frozen moisture. He began with the animals. Inside the barn, the cows stamped their feet and snorted softly, their warm breath curling in the cold air. Thomas moved among them, checking for signs of discomfort. The frost could make hooves crack and bellies bloat if not cared for properly. He fed them extra hay and laid new straw in their stalls, the rustle of it comforting in the stillness. The chickens, too, were restless. He opened the coop and found their water frozen solid. With care, he broke the ice and replaced it with a new bucket, warmed slightly. He scattered grain and murmured to them as they pecked and scratched. Their feathers puffed against the cold, but they would manage. They always did. By mid-morning, the sun had risen higher, but the frost lingered in shaded corners. Thomas set to clearing the last of the carrots from the garden. Their green tops had begun to droop, kissed by the cold, and the earth had grown, stubborn beneath them. He dug slowly, each root a small prize, brushing away soil and laying them into a sack. Margaret joined him soon after, her apron tied tight, carrying a basket for beets and leeks. Together they worked in silence, side by side, hands numb and noses red. There was no room for hurry, only rhythm. Pull, brush, place. Over and over. When they finished, the garden beds were empty, the soil bare and dark. Thomas stood a moment, looking over the space that had fed them for months. It was a strange feeling, part pride, part farewell. Inside, the children were shelling peas by the hearth, their laughter mixing with the crackle of the fire. The house smelled of root vegetables and dried herbs, and Margaret hung bunches of sage from the rafters to dry. She laid the carrots out across the table, sorting them by size, saving the small and crooked ones for stew. Lunch was modest, a thick soup with barley and scraps of mutton, served with warm cider from the last pressing. As they ate, Margaret laid out plans for the coming days. "We'll need to smoke the rest of the meat by week's end," she said. Thomas nodded, "and finish banking the house with moss. I'll ask Sarah to help stuff the chimney cloth." Afterward, he returned to the barn to begin the sealing of the windows. Though small and high, they let in more chill than warmth during the frost months. With tallow and rags, he plugged the cracks, muttering as he worked. The cold had a way of finding its way in no matter the defense. In the late afternoon, he chopped more firewood. Each swing of the axe echoed through the yard, a rhythm as old as the land itself. The wood split clean, the grain sharp and fragrant. He stacked it neatly by the wall, knowing it would be gone all too quickly. As the sun sank low, Thomas paused. The light was golden, glinting through the frost-covered branches. He leaned on the axe handle and watched the way the cold made everything still. Even the birds had gone quiet. It was a holy hush. Inside, the house glowed with warmth. Margaret had lit candles in the windows, and the children were preparing the evening meal, dicing the crooked carrots, adding pinches of salt with solemn care. That night, after the supper was eaten and the fire stoked high, Thomas sat in his chair with his boots off and his feet stretched toward the flames. Margaret read from her Bible softly, her voice steady and sure. The children dozed nearby, curled beneath woolen blankets. As the fire popped and hissed, Thomas reached into his coat pocket and drew out the small strip of willow bark the herb woman had given him. He held it for a moment, then set it gently on the mantel. "The frost is here," he said aloud, more to himself than anyone. Margaret looked up, her eyes soft in the firelight. "It is," she agreed, and with that, they sat together in the flicker of the hearthwood, wrapped in the quiet that only comes when a house is well kept. A harvest is complete, and winter is near, but not yet inside. The fire had been lit just before dawn, long before the cockerels stirred, and the frost had loosened its grip on the thatched roof. A curl of blue-grey smoke drifted from the stone chimney behind the barn, thin as lace and scented with alderwood and oak. This was smoke, not of warmth, but of preservation. The ancient ritual of turning fresh meat into endurance, of folding time into salted flesh. It was Smokehouse Day. For Thomas Whitaker, the smokehouse was a place of quiet labour and reverence. Built of stone, square and low-roofed, it stood behind the main barn, its purpose singular and unchanging. Within it, hooks hung from timber beams, and thick slabs of meat waited. Hams, bacon sides, and lengths of sausage coiled like rope. The air inside was cool, the floor packed earth, and the scent, deep, savoury, eternal, was the mark of survival. The slaughter had been done the previous morning, swift and clean. One pig, large, healthy, well-fed. A year's worth of care had led to a single, solemn moment. Thomas had said nothing as the blade did its work. Silence was the proper form for such things. No celebration. Just thanks. Now came the vigil. He stood by the smokehouse door, watching the fire pit burn down to coals. A nearby bucket of damp sawdust steamed faintly, waiting to be fed into the embers to produce the thick, low smoke that would curl upward through the grate and fill the room with its preserving kiss. Margaret joined him a short time later, her arms full of cloth-wrapped spice bundles. Bay, pepper, juniper. She handed them over without a word, her eyes already scanning the sky. "We'll have 2 dry days," she said. "Then the weather turns." Thomas nodded, feeding more sawdust into the fire. The coals accepted it with a soft sizzle, and smoke began to rise again, slow and steady. They worked together to arrange the meat, rehanging some sides that had slipped their bindings. Thomas wiped each hook before lifting the flesh, his hands sure, his eyes tired but focused. Margaret lit a candle and set it on the windowsill outside the smokehouse, a tradition from her mother's village. A light to keep spirits away, she said, and foxes too if they had any sense. The smoke took hours to build, hours to wrap itself around each cut, and so Thomas settled on a small stool just outside the door, a blanket over his shoulders, the smoke drifting past him like a low fog. From here he could see the barn, the empty field beyond, and the pale line of the lane stretching toward the hills. It was a view he had seen for decades, yet never tired of. The children came and went, bringing water, carrying small bundles of straw, always careful not to linger too long near the smoke. James was especially curious, asking questions about the fire, the sawdust, the time. Thomas answered patiently, though quietly. There was something sacred about the task, something that did not welcome loud voices. As midday passed, Margaret returned with a bowl of pottage and a chunk of rye bread, both still warm. Thomas ate it slowly, his eyes never leaving the drift of smoke from the open door. Each piece of meat within was a promise to his family that come snow, come wind, come the deep hunger of February, there would be food. Not fresh, not soft, but strong, salted, cured, waiting. Smokehouse days were always somber. They reminded a man of the fragility of abundance. As the sun began to lower, its light golden through the trees, Margaret joined him again, this time with 2 mugs of cider. They drank in silence, watching the fire's glow reflect on the damp stones of the smokehouse. "You remember the winter of '66? She asked softly. He did. The winter when frost came early and stayed too long. When the river froze deep enough to crack boats and the potatoes rotted in the earth. When their neighbour's boy died of fever. When Thomas had given up 2 of his smoked hams to feed a widow and her child. I remember," he said, taking another sip. Margaret looked into the smoke. "We didn't have enough that year. We do now. She nodded, setting down the empty mug. By evening, the smoke was thick and fragrant, clinging to Thomas's coat, his beard, his very skin. He stepped into the chamber one final time to check the meat, ensuring it hung properly, that the drip of fat had slowed, that no flare-ups had scorched the walls. The smoke embraced him like a fog, and he stood in it for a long while, breathing it in. It was not pleasant, but it was real. It was the smell of effort and time. Outside, Margaret had lit another candle. The children watched from the window, their eyes wide. This was no small day in their year. It marked the moment the farm turned from harvest to hibernation, from plenty to preservation. Thomas closed the smokehouse door and sealed it with the iron latch. He banked the fire one final time, then stood and stretched. His back ached, but not sharply. It was the slow, steady pull of a man who had done what was needed. Night had fallen fully now. Stars blinked above the thatched roof, and frost was already beginning to settle again on the fence rails. Back inside, the house was warm. The smell of smoke clung to his clothes, but no one minded. They knew its meaning. Margaret ladled out a second helping of stew. Sarah lit a small lantern for the mantel. James handed his father a folded scrap of paper. His attempt at drawing the smokehouse, complete with rising curls and hanging hams. "It's not finished," he said. "Neither. Ye is the season," Thomas replied, ruffling his hair. That night, as Thomas settled into his bed, his dreams were filled with scent and fire. He dreamed of woods and coals, of meat hanging like fruit in a sacred grove, of cold wind kept at bay not by walls or prayers, but by labour and salt and smoke. And somewhere, in that in-between of dream and waking, he heard the faintest echo of a voice, not from the house but from time itself. "You have done enough, for now." The nights had lengthened, creeping in before the supper table was cleared, and lingering long after the children stirred in their sleep. By mid-November, the village lay cloaked in a darkness that arrived not with fanfare, but with a slow, deliberate hush, as though the world itself was tucking in beneath a sky of pewter wool. On the Whitaker farm, the lamps were lit earlier each day. Their amber glow flickered against the windows, warding off the lengthening shadows like sentinels of glass and flame. It was during such evenings that a strange quiet descended, not born of idleness, but of containment. The rush of harvest was done, the preserves were shelved, and the earth itself had drawn inward to rest. But farmers do not hibernate. There was always something to be mended, counted, or planned. And so it was that Thomas found himself seated at the long wooden table. After supper, a ledger opened before him and a stub of pencil in hand. Beside him, Margaret sorted through a basket of spools and threads, repairing the children's mittens, her needle tapping gently against her thimble. A kettle hummed low on the stove, and the children, Sarah, with her nose buried in a dog-eared tale of nights, and James, dozing with his chin upon a carved toy lamb, sat nearby, lulled by the rhythm of routine. Outside, frost had begun to silver the yard. The moon hung low and bright, casting blue light across the thatch and illuminating the shape of the smokehouse in stark outline. The wind, though gentle, pushed at the shutters like a curious hand. Thomas glanced at the ledger again. He'd drawn up a tally of their food stores. Barley sacks, stacked 3 rows deep in the pantry. Dried beans in jars lined along the shelf. Apples in sawdust in the cellar. And meat hanging thick with smoke and thyme. It would last, if the weather was not too cruel. But something else was bothering him. Not the stores, but the growing need for light. With the days shortened, they burned through more oil and beeswax than expected. Already the last large candle had been placed in the lantern by the front door, and their remaining tallow stock was growing low. The lamps were filled half each night, their wicks trimmed carefully, their glow precious. "We'll need to render more fat," Margaret said quietly, as though reading his thoughts. "What's left from the smokehouse could give us a dozen more." He nodded. "If we don't keep the children close by the fire each night, We can stretch what we have." She glanced at the window, where the wind pressed more firmly now. "Still, it grows darker sooner." "It always does this time of year." Margaret laid her mending aside. "We could bring the lanterns down from the loft." "They're old," Thomas murmured. "The glass is cracked. I'll polish them. And the brass. They'll do." And just like that, a plan was formed, quiet and simple. After the children were tucked into bed beneath thick quilts and woolen socks, Thomas climbed the creaky loft ladder and returned with the lanterns, 2 in total. Both were relics from Margaret's mother's time, with fluted glass and bases tarnished by years in storage. They set about cleaning them together, fingers brushing through dust, minds busy with quiet tasks. Thomas repaired the hinge on one with a scrap of wire. Margaret soaked the wicks in vinegar to prolong their burn. They worked in near silence, the only sound the occasional hiss of the fire or the faint breath of wind outside. At last, both lanterns stood on the hearth, gleaming, upright, newly fitted with fresh wicks and filled with the last of the good oil. They were not beautiful, but they were ready. "Tomorrow we'll render what's left," Thomas said. Margaret nodded. "We'll do it by the outdoor fire. The weather should hold another day." He stepped outside briefly, pulling his coat close, to check on the chickens and make sure the barn was locked. The cold hit him square in the chest, sharper than before. The stars overhead were clear and hard, and a thin rime of frost was already forming on the pathstones. He paused there in the yard a moment, looking at the light spilling from the house. Warm, gentle, golden. From this distance, it looked like a lantern of its own, floating in a sea of dark. Inside once more, he shed his coat and returned to the hearth, where Margaret now sat curled in the rocking chair, a shawl around her shoulders. He joined her, sitting on the low stool, holding out his hands toward the fire. "You remember your first winter here?" she asked suddenly. "I do," he said. "You'd sewn lantern covers from sackcloth, said it made the light warmer. I still think it did. Even if it didn't, I believed it." She smiled, and for a time they sat like that, 2 outlines carved in firelight, surrounded by the soft tick of the mantel clock and the gentle sigh of sleeping children. Then, slowly, the flames began to die down. Margaret stirred the embers once more, and Thomas added a small log, just enough to see them through the night without waste. The lanterns flickered. The ledger was closed, and the first long night of winter crept in fully. Not with fear, not with sorrow, but with the steady trust of those who had prepared well, worked hard, and still knew how to sit beside a fire without words. That night, the wind howled softly, but inside, the light endured. The following morning greeted them with stillness. The frost lay thick across every surface, glinting like powdered glass beneath a sky of dull pewter. Trees stood stiff with ice, and the breath of the cows rose like soft chimneys into the cold. But no snow had yet fallen, and for that Thomas Whitaker gave silent thanks. They had one more day of fair sky, enough perhaps to render the fat. By the time the first curl of smoke rose from the outdoor fire pit behind the barn, Thomas had already set the great iron kettle in place, balanced atop stones blackened from previous winters. The kettle, wide, heavy, and as old as his marriage, was a relic of shared labour, and it served but one purpose: to turn scraps of fat into tallow, into light, into endurance. Margaret joined him soon after with the wrapped parcels of trimmed pork fat from the smokehouse. Her hands were wrapped in wool, and her face was pink from the wind, but she moved with certainty. There was no ceremony to the rendering, no blessings or verses, but there was respect, a kind of quiet, steady reverence that neither she nor Thomas would ever speak aloud. They cut the fat into rough cubes, working from a wooden board placed on a barrel lid. The knife moved steadily, rhythmically. The wind tugged at the corners of Margaret's shawl, and somewhere overhead, a crow called once, then again. Thomas added the first heap of fat to the kettle. It hissed as it met the warmed iron, the first drops of liquid pooling at the bottom like golden oil. Slowly they stirred, the long wooden paddle shifting the mass, keeping it from burning. It was not pleasant work. The smell was thick and lingering, earthy, fatty, slightly acrid. Smoke clung to their clothes, and steam rose in damp clouds around them. But it was necessary, and necessity made even the most pungent tasks honourable. James and Sarah were tasked with collecting wood and keeping the fire steady. They took to the work with solemnity, aware that this was no mere chore. They were making light. They were making winter smaller, safer. As the fat melted, the kettle began to sing, a low, wet bubbling that grew more consistent as the solids broke down into liquid. Margaret ladled off the foam, placing it in a tin to be used later for soap. Waste was a word they did not speak. Nothing on a farm was wasted. Not time, not scraps, not memory. By noon, the liquid tallow shimmered at the bottom of the kettle, golden and thick. It would need to cool before pouring, but already Margaret had lined the old candle moulds by the kitchen door, rows of tin tubes with strings looped through their centres, tied carefully around small sticks. Inside, Sarah prepared the moulds with care, while James wrapped the cooled blocks of older tallow in cloth to store in the pantry. Each task mattered. Each hand had a place. Once the kettle was removed from the fire and set to cool, Thomas took a moment to stand, stretching his back, his arms streaked with soot and grease. He looked over the yard, the fading garden, the bundled firewood, the faint trail of prints in the frost, and felt the strange, quiet pride of a man who had done something ancient and essential. Margaret brought him a cup of barley tea and stood beside him, watching the steam rise from the kettle. "This will last us," she said. "Aye," he replied, "and a few for the vicar's widow." She nodded. "Her boy's afraid of the dark. Then he'll have a flame of our making." As dusk approached, they poured the cooled tallow into the moulds, a steady, careful process. The liquid ran thick and slow, filling each cylinder to the top. Once cooled, the candles would be trimmed and stored, small torches for long nights, made not in haste, but in purpose. The smell of the rendering still hung in the air long after the fire had been doused, long after the last mould was filled, and the kettle cleaned and covered. The children helped carry the moulds into the house, and Margaret placed them near the hearth, where the heat would firm them overnight. Dinner was taken late, stewed onions and potatoes, with slices of cold pork and a heel of bread. They ate in silence, not from weariness alone, but from a shared sense of something completed. Later that night, Thomas took one of the newly made candles, still soft and slightly warm, and placed it gently in the brass holder beside his bed. He struck the match slowly, lit the wick, and watched it catch. The flame flickered, then steadied, casting its amber light against the rafters above. It was not grand, it would not light a church or lead a procession, but it was theirs. He sat beside, the flame and thought of all it represented, not just warmth or visibility, but time. It gave them more minutes, more pages of story, more stitches in wool, more whispered prayers. It bought a few more moments at the edge of day. Margaret joined him and drew the covers close. "Tomorrow, we begin mending the winter clothes," she murmured, "and sorting the seed," he added. "There's always something," she smiled faintly in the candlelight. "There is." As the candle burned low, casting soft shadows on the walls, Thomas closed his eyes, not in exhaustion, but in peace. For the night was long, but the light, however small, was theirs. The days that followed passed in a soft rhythm, the sort of tempo that arrives only after harvest ends, and frost becomes the morning's constant companion. It was during this stretch of time, when the ground had stiffened and the trees stood, naked in silhouette, that the Whitaker farmhouse turned inward. The world beyond the hedgerows grew quieter by the hour, as though nature itself had settled into its winter slumber. Inside the farmhouse, however, there was work to be done. Margaret had begun the winter mending. It started, as it always did, with the great oak chest by the hearth, an heirloom from her grandmother's time, its brass hinges worn thin, its lock long forgotten. From within came woolen garments of seasons past, stockings stretched and frayed, mittens with holes at the thumbs, scarves with edges unraveled by time and use. Thomas sat nearby with a mug of warm cider, watching as Margaret spread the garments across the table, smoothing each piece with care. She examined every seam like a physician reading a pulse, her fingers feeling for weak stitches, her eyes catching every pulled thread. Sarah and James joined in, sorting socks and folding sweaters, their small hands helpful, though not always, precise. Sarah had begun learning to stitch under Margaret's quiet tutelage, her stitches still uneven, her knots a bit too firm, but her intent earnest. James, younger and more restless, occupied himself with winding balls of leftover yarn into neat spirals. Margaret had prepared her tools in advance. Needles of varying sizes, a pincushion shaped like a turnip, beeswax for smoothing thread, and a box of buttons that clinked softly like distant bells when moved. The threads were sorted by colour and strength, their spools aligned in a row like soldiers awaiting orders. "Wool is like memory," she said softly to Sarah as she threaded a needle. "It holds warmth, yes, but also, where it's been stretched, where it's been worn, you have to listen to it." Thomas sipped his cider and smiled faintly. Margaret had always spoken of cloth as if it were a living thing. She treated every garment like a story in need of retelling. A sleeve, not just a covering, but a page that had once wrapped around a child's laughter. A shawl, not just for warmth, but for moments spent under moonlight near the garden fence. Fire crackled gently in the hearth, casting golden light over the room. Outside, the wind shifted through the bare branches, sighing faintly against the windows. Inside, the needles clicked and whispered, the thread drawn through wool in soft, repetitive motions. There was peace in the work. Not ease, but peace. Thomas rose and fetched his old coat from the hook near the door. Its hem had frayed, and one of the wooden buttons had split in two. "Add this to the pile?" he asked. Margaret looked at it and nodded. "It's earned its rest. I'll see what I can do." She placed it beside a pair of trousers with worn knees and a mitten missing its pair. These were not cast-offs, not waste. They were simply garments awaiting their second life. As the afternoon deepened, Sarah completed her first repair, a pair of socks with holes at the heel. The stitching was visible, a bit uneven but tight and serviceable. "Good," Margaret said, inspecting them. "Not perfect, but good." Sarah beamed at the praise, and James clapped gently before returning to his yarn spirals, now stacked, like little towers on the corner of the table. Margaret's hands never stopped moving. She stitched as she spoke, threading stories into the wool with every pass of the needle. She told them about the first scarf she ever knit for Thomas, a crooked thing with mismatched stripes that he had worn through the first 3 winters of their marriage. She told of the blanket she had made during her confinement with Sarah, how every square had been stitched with a name, one for each ancestor she could remember. "Stitching," she said softly, "isn't just repair, it's remembering." Later, that day, when the light outside had turned lavender and the fire had burned down to coals, Thomas brought in the box of wool he'd bartered for last market season, undyed, soft, still smelling faintly of lanolin. Margaret accepted it like treasure, lifting each skein and pressing it to her cheek. "We'll make a new blanket," she said. "For the baby?" Sarah asked, eyes widening. Margaret smiled and shook her head. "No baby this winter, but perhaps for next." She didn't elaborate, and no one pressed the thought. That evening, supper was plain but comforting. Lentils with onions and a heel of brown bread dipped in butter. The family ate by lamplight, surrounded by the warmth of wool and fire, by half-mended mittens and rebuttoned coats. It was not a feast, but it was enough. Afterward, Margaret brought out her spindle and began to spin from one of the new skeins. The whir of the spindle wheel joined the soft tick of the clock, and the occasional groan of wood beams settling into the cold. Sarah sat at her side, listening, absorbing, her small hands resting on a length of yarn. Thomas cleaned his boots quietly, oiling the leather, checking the laces. He thought of the days ahead, of gathering more kindling, of checking the grain sacks for pests, of keeping the livestock warm and the paths clear when the snow came. But for that moment, there was only the fire, the wool, and the love that threaded through every garment, every glance, every silence. When they finally rose to bed, Margaret folded the finished garments into a neat pile by the hearth. One pair of mittens, 2 socks, a repaired scarf. The coat, Thomas's coat, would need more work, she said, but she'd saved it from the worst. As they climbed the stairs, Sarah paused and looked back at the pile. "It's like new," she whispered. "No," Margaret said gently. "It's better. It remembers." And with that, the house settled into sleep, wrapped not only in blankets and repaired wool, but in memory and quiet love, a patchwork stronger than frost and warmer than flame. The cellar beneath the Whitaker farmhouse was not large nor lofty. Its ceiling bowed slightly, and the stone walls were darkened with time and moisture, their surfaces lined with shelves, barrels, and old wooden crates. But what it lacked in grandeur, it made up for in purpose. For in that space, cool, steady, and silent, was stored the season's heartbeat, the grains. It was Thomas who descended into it most often, lantern in hand, breath misting before him in the damp air. The wooden stairs creaked beneath his boots, and the moment the door shut above, the cellar swallowed all sound save for the tiny hiss of flame on glass. He had come this morning with a purpose, to take account of their remaining barley and oats, to count sacks, to weigh portions, to prepare for rationing if the winter grew long or the snow too deep for trade. Margaret had packed him a small slate board and chalk to mark numbers, along with a bit of salt pork wrapped in cloth, for cellars. Always sharpened a man's hunger. The lantern's glow revealed the order she had so carefully kept. Sacks were stacked along one wall, each marked in charcoal. B for barley, O for oats, P for potatoes. Jars of dried beans and lentils stood upon the shelves, each labelled in Margaret's neat hand. In the far corner, apples nestled in sawdust, their skins dulled with age but their sweetness preserved. Thomas set down the lantern and exhaled slowly. The stillness was complete. Up above, life went on. Margaret boiling water, the children carrying firewood, but down here, time was paused. He moved to the first stack of barley and opened the top sack. The grain smelled faintly sweet, dry and good. He ran his fingers through it, testing for pests. None. He made a mark on his slate, 4 full sacks. That would be enough, if stretched carefully. Next, he weighed the oats. These were trickier, their use divided between the family and the animals. Too little, and the livestock would suffer. Too much, and the pantry would run thin come February. He calculated slowly, his chalk scratching softly against the board. At midday, Margaret called down from the top of the stairs. "You'll want tea before the chill gets in your hands." He smiled faintly and climbed the stairs to join her. In the kitchen, the warmth was sudden and almost startling. The fire crackled and the kettle steamed. The children were shaping dough into small, rough rounds, their hands dusted in flour. James had flour on his nose, and Sarah was humming softly as she braided a strand of dough into a twisted ring. "We're making bread knots," she said proudly. Thomas nodded. "They'll bake well in the Dutch oven. Good warmth." He sat with Margaret, sipping his tea. "Barley's clean," he reported. "Oats need watching. Some sacks are thinner than I hoped." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "We'll use potatoes more often. Perhaps make barley cakes less. We can manage. We always do." After lunch, he returned to the cellar. This time he carried parchment and a quill, intent on copying the ledger Margaret had asked him to keep. A true winter inventory, to be updated every 7 days. He began with the vegetables, onions stacked in nets, cabbages wrapped in cloth, carrots in crates of damp sand. Each one was counted and notated with quiet precision. As he worked, the hush of the cellar became something almost sacred, a cold peace. Here was the proof of their labor, the result of each blunted blade and blistered hand. The earth had yielded, and they had received. And now it was their charge to keep it, to stretch it, to honor it. He thought of his father, who had taught him to store grain not only with care, but with intention. Each sack is a week of peace, he used to say. Each apple a day with full bellies. Waste is the same as forgetting. Thomas lit a second lantern and moved to the far corner where the preserves sat in glass jars. Jams of plum and gooseberry, pickled beets, even a small jar of rosehip syrup Margaret had boiled with honey for coughs. He counted them slowly, noting their clarity and the colour of their seals. When he reached the final jar, a modest tin of black treacle, he paused. He picked it up and turned it over in his hands, its contents glinting dark and thick. It had been saved, intentionally, for some special day that had not yet come. He set it aside gently, making a quiet mark beside it. Holiday, if earned. By the time the cellar work was finished, twilight had begun to settle across the upper rooms. Thomas closed the cellar door behind him and stood for a moment in the kitchen, listening. The bread knots were cooling on the table, their scent rich and sweet. Sarah was wrapping them in cloth for storage, and James was poking the fire, utterly absorbed. Margaret was near the window, her face turned toward the darkening sky. "How long?" she asked. 2 months, if we're careful. And if we're not? Thomas placed the ledger on the table and met her gaze. "Then 1 month, but we'll be careful." She nodded once and placed the final jar of preserved beans in the cupboard. That night, by the light of one of their new tallow candles, they gathered again near the hearth. Margaret read aloud from an old journal, entries written by her great-grandmother, who had farmed in the moors beyond Yorkshire. The words, faded and spidery, spoke of frost and fire, of mending and hope. Thomas listened quietly, the day's tally still lingering in his mind, yet softened now by the voices of children and the warmth of flame. When at last the candle burned, low and the room dimmed to shadows, Thomas leaned back and closed his eyes. Beneath them, the cellar slept, a silent sanctuary of grain and care. Above, the house breathed gently, and the season, turning ever so slowly, kept its patient watch. The snow had not yet come, but the land was holding its breath. The sky, pale as parchment, hung low above the fields, and the air was still in that peculiar way it becomes when the earth is waiting. Even the crows, usually loud with mischief, sat silent on fence posts, their feathers puffed against the chill. Inside the barn, Thomas Whitaker stood near the small forge he kept for winter repairs. It was a modest thing, an anvil, a bellows, a firebox lined with soot and memory. It was no village blacksmith's forge, but it served when the road to town was too frozen to pass, or when small repairs could not wait for spring. He had built it himself, stone by stone, in the 2nd year of his marriage. Back then, it had seemed unnecessary, almost ambitious. But now, as he placed a rusted hinge upon the anvil and adjusted the coals, it felt like a gift from a younger version of himself, a man who had already known how essential good tools would become. The fire took slowly, stubborn in the cold, but he coaxed it with patience and care, feeding it dry splinters, then coal, then the steady breath of the bellows. Soon, the heat was real, pressing against his face, and the scent of metal and smoke filled the air. He had a list of small mends for the day: a shovel blade cracked near the edge, a broken latch from the chicken coop, the twisted hook from a gate hinge. None were urgent, but all were necessary. Winter did not excuse disrepair, it punished it. As the forge crackled, Margaret entered, her coat drawn close around her and a bundle of tools in her arms. "These too," she said, the broom handles loose and the hinge on the root bins given way. Thomas took them without complaint, laying them beside his work. She lingered a moment longer, watching the flames reflect in the curve of the anvil. "You'll need tea," she said at last. He smiled faintly. "In a bit." She nodded and turned back toward the house, her boots crunching softly against the frosted earth. He began with the shovel. The crack wasn't deep, but it had grown over weeks of use, and with ground now frozen, any fracture would widen fast. He heated the blade until it glowed a dull orange, then laid it flat on the anvil and began to work, striking with rhythm and restraint. Each blow echoed through the barn, a kind of music only a farmer would find beautiful. The rhythm steadied his mind. As the shovel cooled in the trough, he turned to the coop latch, tapping it back into shape with practiced fingers. Then the hook, simple but bent at a crucial angle, was heated and reformed. Piece by piece, he moved through the pile, not rushed, not idle. This was winter work, not as romantic as harvest, not as grueling as planting, but just as sacred. For winter was the time a farmer restored his tools, and in doing so, restored himself. Outside, the wind had begun to rise. It moaned through the trees, rattling loose branches and drawing a soft whistle through the barn's rafters. Inside, the forge's warmth held steady, and Thomas, hands blackened with soot and steel, moved with calm purpose. At midday, Margaret returned with tea and a wedge of cheese wrapped in cloth. She set them down on the workbench, brushing ash from her sleeves. "You'll want to rest your eyes," she said gently. "You've been bent over that anvil since morning." He straightened slowly, nodding. "It's nearly done." She looked at the repaired tools with quiet approval. "I'll see if Sarah can polish them after supper." "Let her," he said. "It's good work for idle hands." Margaret lingered a moment longer, then slipped away, her figure vanishing, into the grey afternoon. Thomas sat on a crate and sipped the tea, the steam curling against his face. He listened to the fire pop and hiss, and for a while, did nothing. It was a rare and cherished thing, this pause, earned, honest, brief. When he rose again, he gathered the mended tools and laid them gently in their places. The shovel with the others, handles aligned like fence rails. The hook and latch into the wooden drawer marked barn. Even the broom handle, now firm and wrapped with twine, was propped neatly by the door. He banked the fire, shut the iron door, and wiped his hands on a rag of old linen. Then he stood in the center of the barn and looked around. The air still smelled of smoke and steel, and the warm pocket near the forge was beginning to cool. But there was satisfaction in it, in the completeness, the restoration, the readiness. He stepped outside. The sky had darkened, not from sun, but from snow. The first flakes had begun to fall, slow, lazy spirals drifting from above. They kissed his coat and melted in his beard. He watched them with the solemn wonder only a man of the land could feel. This too was labor, to watch, to witness, to wait. He returned to the house, the snow now falling faster. Inside, the fire was bright, and the children were drawing shapes in the steam upon the window panes. Sarah had crafted a sun with long curling rays. James had made a sheep with fat legs and a crooked smile. Margaret was stirring a pot, the scent of lentils and rosemary filling the air. "The snow's started," Thomas said. She turned, brow raised. "Early," he nodded. "A quiet snow." She smiled. "Good. Let it come." That evening, as the storm thickened, Thomas placed a single repaired tool, a wooden mallet, on the mantel, not for use, not for show, just to remember. Its handle was worn smooth, its head cracked but whole. It had built their fence, their gate, the swing James once played on before the rope snapped. Sarah touched it once before bed, her fingers running, along the grain. "It's old," she said. "Yes," Thomas replied, "but strong." And so was the family that rested beneath the roof it had helped raise. Outside, the wind whispered. The snow deepened, and inside, the tools, like the hearts of those who wielded them, were ready for whatever winter would bring. The snow had settled thick and deep. By morning, the world had been reshaped. Hedgerows vanished beneath smooth drifts. Paths and lanes erased as if never trodden. The barn roof bore the weight of silence, its beams creaking faintly under the crystalline hush. Even the crows, those relentless heralds of motion, had given up their cries and huddled silently in the trees. Inside the Whitaker farmhouse, the warmth of the hearth drew long shadows across the wooden floorboards. Thomas stirred before dawn, as he always did, but the urgency of movement was softened by the snow. Today was the Sabbath, and even a farmer had learned that snow could speak its own command. Be still. The air in the house was heavy with the comfort of routine. Margaret had risen early to tend the fire, and the children were still wrapped in sleep, their breath fogging the window panes near their beds. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the shutters, but it carried no threat, only the rhythmic breath of winter. Thomas washed at the basin, dressed slowly, then stepped to the door to assess the depth. The snow reached nearly to the bottom of the gate. Beyond it, the fields were transformed, white and silent, as if untouched by labor or time. "We'll not go far today," he murmured. Margaret came beside him, wrapping her shawl tight. "Nor should we." She handed him a warm mug of barley tea, thick with honey and clove. Together they stood and watched the snow in silence, sipping slowly, sharing the comfort of a morning that required nothing of them but stillness. Sundays on the farm were rarely restful in summer. There was always a hinge to oil, a row to weed, an animal in need of tending. But in winter, especially under snow, there was space to pause. The livestock had been fed extra the evening before, and their shelters were strong. The cellar was full, the water barrels inside unfrozen. The house, for once, had no demands, and so the day unfolded like a page long held shut. Margaret prepared a breakfast of baked apples and coarse oatcakes, sweetened with a spoon of rosehip syrup. The children rose sleepily to the scent and gathered, near the fire, rubbing their eyes, hair tousled. Sarah wore a shawl stitched from leftover wool, too long in the arms. James's nose was pink from cold, but his eyes bright. "Is it Sunday?" he asked. "It is," Margaret replied. "And snowbound besides." His face lit with delight. After breakfast, the family gathered in the sitting room. Margaret brought down the psalter from the shelf, its leather cracked and soft from use. She read aloud from Psalm 65, her voice gentle, the words carrying more resonance in the hush. "Thou visitest the earth and waterest it. Thou greatly enrichest it." The cadence of scripture felt older than the house, older than the family, older even than the snow that blanketed the hills. It was not dogma, but rhythm, a language of seasons, of mercy, of provision. It echoed in the fire's crackle, in the slow drift of snow past the window. After the reading, Thomas opened a small wooden box he kept near his chair. From within, he pulled the family's photograph, a faded image taken years before in the village square. In it, his father stood tall and solemn, a hand resting on a young Thomas's shoulder. Margaret sat beside him, her eyes bright. Sarah just a baby in her arms. James had not yet arrived. He passed it to Sarah, who studied it as if reading a map. "You were smaller," she said, smiling. Thomas nodded. And so was the farm. They spoke of memories then, not in boast or sentiment, but in quiet offering. Of the year the chimney froze, and Margaret had cooked on stones in the yard. Of the snowfall that brought a fox into the barn, and how Thomas had scared it off with only a pitchfork and a hymn. As the fire warmed the room, James fetched his drawing slate and began to sketch the trees outside, their bare arms reaching through the snow. Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, knitting a square for a blanket they might finish by spring. The room was filled with the soft rustle of wool, the scratch of chalk, the steady breath of winter peace. At midday, Margaret brought out a loaf of rye bread and a jar of summer chutney. They ate slowly, savouring each bite, each taste like a memory of warmth. The chutney was tart with rhubarb and sweetened with apples. It had been a good harvest. Later, Thomas opened the window near the hearth just a crack. The cold poured in briefly, sharp and invigorating. He watched as flakes settled gently on the sill, unmelted in the chill. "We won't see the road until Thursday, I'd wager," he said. "Then we'll stay as we are," Margaret replied. The children laughed and curled beside the fire, wrapped in blankets stitched with initials from 3 generations. Margaret fetched her journal and began recording the day, the snowfall, the firewood count, the readings. She included the moment James found an old button in the rug and declared it a knight's shield. Outside, the light dimmed early. The sky turned violet, and the edges of the snow took on a faint blue glow. The world was muted but luminous. As dusk fell, Margaret lit a lantern and placed it in the window. "For travellers," she said, though none would come. But the gesture was old, and in keeping with the day. Supper was hot broth with barley and slices of roasted turnip. Afterward, Thomas played a quiet tune on the whistle he'd bought for James at market, the melody weaving through the candlelight like thread through cloth. Margaret hummed along, and Sarah closed her eyes, leaning against her father's knee. When, at last, the candles burned low and the fire was banked, the family climbed to their beds beneath heavy quilts. Outside, the snow fell on, undisturbed. The wind was soft, almost reverent, as it passed through the orchard and along the barn, and, in that quiet, sacred dark, the Whitakers slept, not anxious, not striving, but carried gently by the hush of winter's grace. The snow did not let up for 4 days. It drifted steadily and quietly, weaving a blanket over the world that seemed to thicken time itself. In those frozen mornings, when even the barn door groaned against its hinges and the chickens refused to leave their coop, the Whitakers fell deeper into the rituals of winter, warmth, patience, and the passing of stories. It was on the 5th morning, when the wind had calmed and the sun broke in soft beams through the clouds, that Thomas fetched the writing box from the high shelf above the mantel. The box was old oak, bound with brass. Inside were quills, ink pots sealed with wax, and folded paper with edges softened from age. Most of the year it sat untouched, but in winter, especially deep in snow, it became a vessel for remembrance, for reaching beyond the frost to others, far off. That morning, with the fire crackling low and the children helping Margaret wind yarn into skeins, Thomas sat down to write. The first letter was to his brother, Henry, who lived in Devonshire. They had not seen one another in 3 winters. Travel in the season was costly and slow, and with families of their own, visits had become promises always postponed. Thomas dipped his pen and began. "Dear Henry, the snow has come early this year, and with it, the quiet." He wrote of the harvest, of the barley's strong yield, of the oat sacks that needed rationing. He mentioned Sarah's knitting, James's drawings, and the new tallow candles they had poured by hand. He did not dwell on hardships. Such was not their way. Instead, he painted a picture in words, of frost on the barn roof, of bread knots rising by the fire, of Margaret reading aloud beside the lantern's light. When the letter was sealed with wax and set aside, he penned another, this one to the vicar's widow, who now lived in the village almshouse. He included a dried sprig of lavender from Margaret's summer store and a recipe for cough tonic they had perfected with the herb woman's guidance. Sarah offered to decorate the envelope with a sprig of painted holly. She dipped her brush in berry-coloured ink and added 3 dots beside a curling leaf. "For cheer," she said. "It looks less cold that way." By midday, the letters were done, 5 in total, each bearing a different hand, a different purpose. One to Henry, one to the widow, one to the blacksmith, offering to trade kindling for nails when the thaw came. One to Margaret's cousin near the coast, and one to a friend now farming in Yorkshire who had written last year of losing a child. To fever, that one Thomas wrote most carefully. We still speak of her, he wrote, in quiet moments, in the way Sarah gathers flowers, in the way Margaret hums as she bakes. Grief does not shrink, but it becomes softer in company. When the letters were finished, Margaret bundled them with twine and placed them in a small basket by the door. They'll wait for the carrier, she said. He comes after a thaw. The rest of the day moved gently. James, growing restless after so many days indoors, was given the task of counting lantern wicks. He took it seriously, lining them up on the table and declaring one too short for safe use. Sarah helped Margaret sew a new cover for the psalter, the old one having frayed at the corners. Thomas returned to the barn to check the livestock, stomping through the snow, boots crunching with each step. Inside, the animals were warm, if not pleased. He spoke to them softly, offering extra hay and clearing the edges of their stalls. Later, he paused by the gate. From there, he could see the lane, still buried but now glinting under the sun's shy return. Beyond it lay the rest of the world. The village, the smithy, the parish, and the twisting roads that connected each life like threads in a woolen shawl. He did not long for travel, but he did long to be known. And writing letters, he believed, was a way of planting presence where feet could not tread. That night, as the candles burned low and Margaret read again from her grandmother's journal, this time a passage about a lost lamb rescued from a snowbank, Thomas sat with the writing box open on his lap, checking his ink, trimming the quills, preparing. You'll write again soon, Margaret asked softly. He nodded. When the next snow comes. I'm glad you wrote to the vicar's widow. She lost more than we know. He looked toward the mantel, where the wax seal cooled beside the drying lavender. I wrote what I could. Margaret placed her hand over his. That's all we ever do. The wind picked up again that night, rattling the shutters, whispering beneath the doorframe. But inside, the warmth held, and across the snow-covered hills, though unsent and unread, the letters waited. Carriers of stories, stitched with ink and patience. The words would go out, in time. But for now, they kept the pulse of connection alive, quietly, faithfully, like candlelight behind thick glass. The snow began to recede in the third week of February. It did not melt all at once, but thinned gradually, revealing patches of brown earth near the southern-facing wall and softening the edges of the well-worn path to the barn. The air was still cold, crisp enough to chafe the cheeks and bite through wool, but the wind carried a new scent, faint and electric. A scent of thaw. Inside the Whittaker farmhouse, the hearth still burned each morning, but not with the urgency it had in early winter. The children now rose without coaxing, stirred by light returning to the window panes, and the gentle chorus of drip, drip, drip from the eaves. The chickens began to lay more steadily again, and even the cows, quiet through the frost months, stood, with more alertness in their eyes. Spring was not yet here, but it had remembered them. On the last Sunday of the month, Thomas rose early to make a final round of winter inspections. He checked the root cellar, its stock now visibly thinner but sufficient. He tapped each barrel of grain and ticked a mark in his ledger. Then he walked the perimeter of the property, boots squelching in half-thawed ground, mud and snow mixing in sluggish rivulets down toward the lane. He paused near the fence post where the scarecrow once stood, long since packed away in the barn. Only the post remained, leaning at an angle, as if waiting for someone to set it straight. A few stubborn stalks of barley, flattened by snow, poked through the soil nearby, ghosts of last year's plenty. Back inside, Margaret was kneading dough beside the window, sleeves rolled, hair tied with ribbon. Sarah and James were sorting the last of the seed stores, beans, peas, lentils, preparing them for spring planting. The small earthen bowls were spread across the table, their contents carefully labelled and measured. The black beans didn't store as well, Sarah reported solemnly. We'll make do with what we have, Margaret said, without looking, up from her work. We always do. Thomas joined them and sat down beside the seed bowls. He picked up a pea between his fingers, wrinkled, pale, inert, and held it to the light. "Funny, isn't it?" he murmured. "Something so small could turn into a whole field." James looked up, blinking. "But how does it know?" Thomas smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "It doesn't need to know, it just remembers." The family spent the day tending to small things, brushing out the wool rugs, patching the last of the mittens, wiping the window glass free of soot. Thomas oiled the hinges on the tool shed and checked the spade heads for rust. Margaret aired out the bedding and readied the linen closet for spring washing. It was the quiet labour that came between seasons, the kind that never earned praise, but without which nothing stood. By late afternoon, a warmth lingered in the sunlight spilling across the table. It wasn't heat, not yet, but a softness. The edge had dulled. The wind no longer howled. The silence of snow had turned into a different stillness. An exhale. Margaret prepared a supper of fried onions, root cakes, and the last of the salted pork. It was a humble meal, but when they sat down to eat, the mood was oddly festive, as though some invisible curtain had been drawn back. They laughed easily, recalling the time the goats had broken into the herb patch, or when Thomas slipped and fell into the cabbage row with a thud heard halfway to the parish. Afterward, Margaret brought out the small jar of black treacle they'd saved, the one Thomas had set aside in the cellar during the earliest inventory. "A sweet for what's behind us," she said, dipping a spoon into the thick, dark syrup. They each had a spoonful, even James, who scrunched his nose and declared it sticky as swamp. The laughter that followed warmed the room more than any fire. Later that evening, Thomas carried the empty treacle jar to the mantel. He placed it beside the willow bark from the herb woman, now long dried and curled with age, and the patched mallet they'd kept near the fire all winter. "These," he said quietly, "are the proof." Margaret looked up from her chair, where she sat knitting what might become a shawl, or a blanket, or a summer tablecloth. "Proof?" "That we lived through it." She didn't answer, but her smile said she understood. Outside, the stars returned. Their light, though still cold, felt sharper now, less obscured by cloud or snow. A fox crossed the lane, its slender form quick and quiet, and an owl called once from the old ash tree, signs of life moving again. Before bed, Thomas stood in the doorway one last time. The sky was clear, and the moon hung low and wide. He listened, not for storm, not for silence, but for the soft, almost imperceptible murmur of earth waking, and he heard it, the drip of snowmelt, the creak of thawing limbs, the far-off splash of water against stone. Small sounds, but real. When he returned inside, Margaret had already banked the fire, and the children were asleep. The house was warm, quiet, whole. He climbed into bed, drawing the blanket up to his chin. His muscles ached in a familiar, grateful way. Tomorrow would bring lists and preparations, spades in the soil, and seeds to cast into the waiting earth. But tonight, they had survived the winter. And in the marrow of his bones, he believed the green would return. It always did.